Okay, thank you, Jerry. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for pulling this group together. We'll be together for the next 45 minutes or so. Before I get started, just a couple of wrap-up points from Share in Fort Worth. The first thing I want to make sure everybody understands, my modest friend here, Jerry Ziefel, is the chairman of the security working group of Share and did an incredible job of pulling together a great set of presenters within that track and was very, very well received. I attended a number of those sessions, but I also attended a number of closed door sessions and also IBM presentations with a few tidbits that I want to share with you. The first thing is that the overarching theme of the closed door sessions and many of the Share IBM presentations is cybersecurity. There's no doubt that as it relates to the Z15 and as it relates to ZOS and other hypervisors that run on the Z15 architecture, that IBM is quite serious about providing continuous reinforcement of the idea that it's the most securable platform for general purpose business computing. A couple of points there that are surfacing. The first one is that if you haven't gotten up close and personal with ZOSMF, you need to do it. You need to get on that horse, that's Texas talk, learn how to ride it, and you need to do that before 2.5 becomes available, because it's quite likely by the time 2.5 comes around, you won't be able to download anything either from Shop Z in the form of actual code, whether that's operating system or applications, or migration aids, now called update aids, and make those functional within your environment. They are quite serious about ZOSMF, and I think by 2.5 it's going to absolutely be a requirement. As it relates strictly to security, we know that IBM has introduced a new set of code which they refer to as code integrity scanning. They've made that available in the form of a beta version that selected customers are using, and certainly selected vendors. New Era happens to be one of those vendors. The purpose of that is to identify code vulnerabilities, that is, code issues that may open vulnerabilities in the ZOS environment that might impact the integrity of ZOS and any LPARs that are running it. It's not a free service. It will ultimately be a chargeable service, and quite likely, if you are going to use it, you'll be involved in a relationship with vendors who have code that may violate those integrity standards in order to get them cleaned up as quickly as possible. I think it's a good thing, perhaps long overdue, but it's a good thing, and it'll be coming your way shortly if you're not already in the program. The next one is what's referred to as boot integrity. Many of you know that IBM mainframe computers and the virtual environments that they support, particularly with ZOS, are able to achieve the highest level of ratings, what are called ELS 5 type ratings, that say these things are very, very secure. Again, they're very serious about maintaining those ratings, and also very serious about improving them. One of the things that they are doing, boot integrity, will result in the digital signing of all code that is downloaded from Shop Z. So your sysres packs, all of your applications, any of the PTFs that will come along in the future, will ultimately wind up with digital signatures. The reason for this is to prevent what is often referred to as in-stream injection. In-stream injection is a threat space, if you would, a vulnerability, where you might get something, download it, put it on the shelf for 6 months, and then ultimately attempt to install it. While it's on the shelf, some nefarious person could alter that in some way and inject a vulnerability into a code base that you are going to use. Quite verbal here in the presentations that were made were containers. Containers are going to be everywhere. ZCX is the moniker that's placed on these containers. They typically run as ZOS started tasks. Within those tasks are included things like Docker as an example. And those Docker files are typically Linux applications that are being migrated from server farms to run in a ZOS environment, in an LPAR, to take advantage of the kinds of services that are normally, or excuse me, not normally, but by standard, can be taken advantage of in a ZOS environment. Things like backup, disaster recovery, all of the monitoring capabilities that are just a part of the ZOS environment. Of course, doing that is going to place a burden on you to make sure that your TCP/IP networks are appropriately configured and appropriately protected. Of course, we highly recommend the use of Pageant and all of the components that are associated with that. IBM did announce that for ZNext, for those of you that follow this closely, you know that the term ZNext applies to the next level of hardware, so we're talking about the Z16. The chips that will be made for the Z16 will be made by Samsung. The specifications for the chips are such that the density, when compared to the chips that are used for a Z15, is such that there will be additional room in the same footprint for additional functions. And the functions that are on the table to be considered are those that apply to cryptology. This would be specifically in the area of key wrapping in order to provide the kind of protection that's necessary for keys that are used for perhaps asynchronous encryption. Additional functions will include compression, sort, I/O acceleration, and then the final point is called quantum safe. I think that's a tip of the hat to quantum computing. I don't know if it is truly quantum in nature, but it's called quantum safe, and it is sometimes referred to as hyper protect. And that sort of wraps up what I had in mind to talk to you about from the things that I took away from SHARE. It was very exciting. There was lots of new things that are going on. The enthusiasm for ZOS that was demonstrated on the part of Broadcom and IBM presenters was incredible. The outlook for the next few years seems to be great, and so it was a very worthwhile share. So that's my story there. As far as this story is concerned, that is why ZOS is the rock, let me give you a little bit of an orientation as we get started. The first thing is that Jerry mentioned this presentation was given to the next-gen community. These are people who are coming along that want to get involved in ZOS, want to get involved with IBM mainframes. I'll tell you an anecdotal story when we get closer to the end if I have the time, but my concern has always been for the last 5 years or so that for young people coming into this business, that the hill that they have to climb in order to get a foothold that they can depend on, that they can move forward from, is extremely difficult. I break the mastery of the mysteries of ZOS that they face into 3 specific areas: education, exposure, and experience. Now, experience can only come with time. Exposure can only come with your willingness to give it to them in the form of mentoring. And education can only come in the form of them attending presentations like this one and others that they attend and share. But by any stretch of the imagination, these are 101 presentations. These are the presentations that give them the opportunity to hear the language that we use and how we apply it so that they in turn can apply it to their work exposure and build on that exposure and their experience. Now, the next point for orientation is, why did I choose the title ZOS is the Rock? Well, one perhaps way to describe that would essentially be, hey, it's big, it's hard, impenetrable, securable. It's got all of those characteristics. But what I really had in mind was something else. What I really wanted to emphasize in that title was that we are the hardest working people in the room. In some cases, we're not necessarily the smartest people in the room, but we'll be in the room until the job gets done. And the reason we can do that is because we're disciplined. And that discipline plays to our commitment. And so much like Dwayne Johnson here, he didn't always look like that. But at some point, he entered into an agreement with himself that said, I'm going to be the hardest worker. And in order to be the hardest worker, I have to be disciplined and committed. And this was the rock that I had in mind when I chose this title. Now, when he made that agreement with himself, he, in essence, was mirroring the kind of agreements that you make with your users regularly. They're called service level agreements. And they are statements of shared objectives. In the case of IS, they include reliability, availability, serviceability, in the IBM vernacular, RAS, and also includes integrity and security, ISEC. The most famous of all the service level agreements is the one that IBM entered into with its customers back in the early 70s. That's referred to as the IBM ZOS Statement of System Integrity. This is a statement that essentially says, to the extent that it's possible to do so, through design practices and implementation, IBM will assure you that no one will be able to gain access to a level that places them equivalent to the operating system without you, the customer, specifically granting that access right. We call that APF, and we'll talk about that and the services that APF provides at a later point in this presentation. These service level agreements that exist between us and our users have a legacy behind them. And I always encourage young people to go find out what the legacy is, not just to accept the service level agreement the way it is written or defined. And if it's not written and it's not defined, I encourage them to go define it and write it so that everybody knows what the service level agreement is. But these service level agreements generally begin as a byproduct of some management process, the standard B-school process that you see here in this particular slide. We plan, we organize, we staff, we execute, we monitor, we provide all kinds of feedback. As a result of that, we at some point have to make things actionable. And so we look at plans that are presented to us and we approve them. We give them budgets, we give them funds, and we provide controls in the form of audits that allow us to know that these plans and their execution are in compliance with standards that are appropriate for the project and appropriate for our organization. The question becomes then, in an IT environment, how do we know that these standards that we need to put in place to support the compliance objectives of our product, whether those compliance objectives are placed on us by management or whether they're placed on us by industry or government regulation, how do we know that we're in compliance? What we implement in order to do that are what are referred to as policy decision points, PDPs. A policy decision point is a system entity that makes authorization decisions for itself and other system entities that request its service. The best known policy decision points are RACF, ACF2, and Top Secret. They are the external security managers. Their name derived from the fact that they're not part of the operating system. They're outside of the operating system. They're the external security managers. But even though they represent strong, enforceable strong enforceable rules that they will take care of for us, these policy decision points do not live alone. They require companions. Those companions are referred to as policy enforcement points. And in the ZOS environment, that enforcement point is often referred to as the System Access Facility, or SAF. SAF is a system process that is called by RACF, ACF2, and Top Secret to enforce its policies. And enforcing those policies is such that it will make right, if you would, what the external security manager requests. So if a user is not authorized to do a certain set of work, if someone isn't authorized to access a port or access anything, the job queue as an example, or issue a command, or even log on, it's the external security manager that will make the base decision, policy decision point, and it's SAF that will actually enforce it because it is the policy enforcement point. Now, one of the precepts of good management is to provide, to the extent that it's possible and productive, a separation of duties and responsibilities within the organization itself. Now, within the IT organization, generally speaking, we begin to think of these separations as silos. A silo where hardware is dealt with, that is, it has its own organization, its own staff, it has its own goals and objectives, and perhaps those that are responsible in operations for the IPL of the system. Again, own goals, own staff, own responsibility, and on and on. In this case, TCP/IP, IP security, and the external security manager. But these silos can't operate independently of each other. They have to, in some way, begin to communicate and chain themselves together so that the output of one becomes the input of the other, so that it can continue the process until we have a fully functional system, a fully functional ZOS system. So here are some linkages that we're going to focus on throughout the rest of the presentation. The IODF, the input-output definition file, which links the hardware in the form of the IOCP, the input-output configuration program, to a specific IPL process for the generation of a ZOS LPAR, the OSCP, the operating system control program. And as that process takes place, one of the members that will be processed is BPX PRM. That BPX PRM member will not only help us to define within our ZOS environment a Unix file system, but it'll also define for us the names and the operational capabilities of the TCP/IP stack that we will need to support both intra and external or internet networks. We need to provide security over that stack in our TCP/IP network, and we can do that with a tool that's called Pageant. And Pageant will give us the capability of putting in place intrusion detection systems, but also will allow us to take advantage of it seamlessly of tools like ATTLS. ATTLS is a part of the pageant environment that allows us to seamlessly protect applications and the application traffic as it leaves an LPAR and proceeds on through the network to a security endpoint. In addition, we also need to find linkages between this network traffic and the services that can be provided by the external security manager, and link those together using SAV. In this particular case, we're looking at a port definition, critical for us as we attempt to communicate with others outside of our ZOS environment. We have to leave through a port. We can protect that port with SAF using the servauth class of profiles provided by the external security manager, RACF. So this is going to be our discussion from this point forward. We're going to talk about the IODF first, then we're going to drill down into the IPL, then we're going to talk about Pageant and the components of it and how it fits together and how the external security manager brings the pieces together to provide us with a secure network environment. The IODF, in my opinion, is at the center of the configuration of any ZOS Z15 environment. It is the tool that your hardware people will use to parcel out the componentry and the power of the central processing complex. In doing it, what you would see if you could stand far enough back and see the content of the IODF would be a configuration that in many ways mirrors the configuration of your organization directly. You're going to have divisions within your organization. Those divisions are going to need computing resources. In this case, our company XYZ is broken down into two divisions, north and south. And when we look at the IODF, we will likely find within it provisioning that makes certain that the components of the central processor and the central processing complex would be divided in a way that matches the needs of each of those divisions. And within one division, north, several processes then would wind up perhaps with their own LPARs that would be described quite frequently with names that represent them, not necessarily directly, but in a way that could be related to them and understood by the people in your IT organization. It is this central point that makes it the most important policy decision point in the entire ZOS environment. Because when management makes the decision to buy a Z15, someone in that management chain aggregated the requirements of all of the divisions together and says, yes, that is a justification for this. And when that IODF was created, it followed in large measure the justification that the financial people used and creates an environment that mirrors the organization directly. Now, when you do work with an IODF, when you do define it and you parcel things out, quite typically you sort of feel like a plumber. You're kind of hooking things together. You're taking a channel subsystem complex that has 256 physical channels, and you're parceling it out to 6 different, possibly different, logical channel subsystems. And it's within these logical channel subsystems where the LPARs live. It's in these logical channel subsystems where the LPARs are defined. And in each one of these LPARs, we could define it as a ZOS LPAR, or we could define it as a VM LPAR, or we could define it in some other way. But when we're done, we will have taken those 256 channels and physical channels, and we will have mapped them into these logical channel subsystems, creating 1,536 virtual paths to the channels themselves. One of the things to always keep in mind about the LPARs that are created through this process, they are independent of each other. They are totally secure of each other. And whether they're running VM or whether they're running ZOS, as far as the operating system is concerned, they are totally independent. They totally have access to their own hardware. They are as if they were independent machines. The ability for IBM to provide such capability gives this environment the evaluation assurance level of 5, which is the highest that is available today in terms of providing the assurance that the security of this system is as high as it possibly can get. Now, by this point, we now have two halves of what is referred to as a device chain. On the one hand, we have an IOCP and all of its linkages, and on the right hand, we have the OSCP, the operating system control program, and all of its linkages. But we don't yet have the full addressability that's necessary for an individual LPAR to actually be able to talk, to the hardware and conversely talk to the network itself. That only arises when we have a power on reset. When we have a power on reset, we actually link the IOCP and the OSCP together as a single chain of activities, attributes if you would, that give a running instance of ZOS the direction that it needs in order to be able to make an appropriate connection. Now, once we've done a power on reset and we begin the process of an IPL, there are 3 specific points that I want to emphasize that I believe are critical. Point A, point B, and point C. The first point to be made at point A I mentioned earlier. In the very near future, the sysres pack that you would use in an IPL, a cold start, is going to be digitally signed. So you need to be on the lookout for that. So that's the beginning. By the time we get to point B, no matter how strongly we believe in ZOS and what its powers are, what will have been accomplished is that we will have loaded into memory the link list, the LPA list, the APF list, and some of the modules, the sum of the 30, 40,000 modules, programmable program entities that exist within that triad of an environment are going to have special attributes. Those attributes, in essence, are policy decision points. The most important one is AC, the access code or authority code, application code. Can't remember which one right now, but when it's 01, it's really important because it gives it capabilities that allow it to achieve that level I mentioned earlier. That is, APF authorization will allow that particular module to achieve a level that is equivalent to the kind of services that only the operating system can perform. It could read somebody else's memory, perhaps overwrite it, corrupt it, do whatever it essentially wants. There are other components that can modify the authority that is given to an individual module, and they are contained, those modifications are contained in what I like to refer to as the 3 amigos: exits, the program property table, and SVCs. These 3 guys have the capability of taking an individual module or process and promoting it up to a state that can be referred to as syskey. That is, where a module now or a process is now able to operate at the same level of the operating system itself. It is in this world where the new services that IBM is offering, that is this code vulnerability scanning, is going to have an impact not only on IBM, but also on third parties like New Era that contribute code to this process itself. And there are other components that are also critical here as well. Now, when that process is done, when all these pieces fit together, vendor code is in, IBM's code is in, everything's been loaded into memory, we're good to go. The first thing that the operating system does is it creates an environment which is called an address space. And this address space, the first one that's created, is called ASID1. So we were sitting at an HMC, the hardware management console. We got a unit address, we got a load parm, we got a sysres volume. We loaded the IRIMs, the IPL resource initialization modules, the OSCP parm lib. We turned the parm lib into directors and parameters. We put in all of our load libs. We read the master JCL. ASID1 is up and functional. But as functional as it can only respond to 3 specific commands: log on, mount, and start. Log on is pretty self-explanatory. By now, users could actually log on to the system. Mount is critically important because mount gives us the ability to mount the DASD that will be necessary for storing information. The individual DASD volumes that are out there at this moment are described by unit addresses, and we'll want to describe them more appropriately with volume names and other kind of characteristics. And then the third command, which is start, which means that we can now take one of the tasks that is perhaps a leadoff module in a chain of modules that is in the APF list or the link list or the LPA list, but likely has an AC code of 1, and we can request that the system start it up. But before we do that, we've got some other things that we've got to bring into consideration. The external security manager needs to come to life, as does multi-factor authentication. Staff needs to come to life so that the external security manager as a policy decision point has someone to enforce things for it. We need to know about the profiles and the permits that are associated with each of the operational functions that will be performed here, which users can log on, which jobs can reach the job scheduler, or JES. We need to know what the APF environment looks like, so we had to load our APF list up into memory somewhere. And if there are other components that are specialized, like XERT as an example, those need to come to life as well. Behind all of this, as users log on, we're going to find another component which is called the ACEE, the assessors. Oh God, I always lose that one. But anyway, let's just leave it at ACEE for the moment. It's a set of access rights that an individual user has that give him special permissions. For example, operations authority, perhaps special authority, perhaps trusted authority. These authorities can give him the ability to do things that are beyond the scope of what he might ordinarily be permitted to do. It has been for some time that clever people have found ways to actually spawn other ACEEs or change them. Recently, IBM put in a process within RACF to capture those kinds of changes, and they are reported to the console using the RACF message IRR 421I. And if you don't have some process for monitoring your console messages, you should get one and monitor specifically for that one. So now we have a system. We've loaded everything up. We've got ASID1 up. We've got the master JCL functional. We loaded all the modules. We checked everything out. We've got SAF, we've got the External Security Manager, we've got APF. We're about ready to go from B to C, but something else has to happen. We have to have a final determiner. We have to have someone who says, okay, yeah, I know all that. I know what all these settings are. I've tracked all of this. You're about to execute a job, you got to come through me. And I'm the dispatchable unit control table, often referred to as the duck. And if you can't get through me, if you're not APF authorized, if you are APF authorized and you're not coming from an APF authorized library, you're not getting through me. If you don't have the appropriate authority to execute that program, you're not coming through me. When the duck fails an attempt to start a particular program, a particular privileged program, then what happens is it writes a message to the console as well. And that message is referred to as an SO47, or other messages that have to do with the failure of an attempt to start an authorized program, a 406, a 706, and perhaps an 806. Now, it wouldn't be so bad if this was program by program, and there was a lot of time that was taking place between the execution of these. But between point B and C, we might be talking about just a matter of minutes when hundreds of different programs are started. Hundreds of perhaps CICS regions are attempted to be started, all of which is being done through a process of automation. Perhaps an automation tool from BMC or from Broadcom or from IBM, as the case may be, that contains all the starts of all the jobs that have to be brought to life in order for the system, by the time it arrives at point C, to be fully functional and able to provide the service that was agreed to in that original service level agreement. Now, here's what the ZOS environment looks like at that point. We have the ZOS image up, and within that ZOS image, we have a number of address spaces. One of those address spaces, in this case, two of those address spaces, are devoted to ZCX Docker containers that are running some Linux application that has been migrated from a server farm into that address space in order to take advantage of the services that can be provided by a ZOS LPAR. Now, while this picture may seem complete, it is actually only the beginning. Because what we've really done here is not define just a bunch of LPARs, a bunch of address spaces, but we've defined an LPAR and the address spaces in it together now represent a security endpoint. That is, we are just about ready to begin to try to communicate with the outside world. And when we do that, we have to begin to give some thought to the kind of end-to-end security that we want to be able to provide to all of our users as they attempt to make the connection between them as a security endpoint and whatever destination they have in mind. The way in which this is typically broken down is that while we are in a state that exists inside the address space, inside the LPAR itself, we are looking at data essentially at rest. And here's where we often hear the term pervasive encryption. The data inside this environment is pervasively encrypted. Between the KEC and the DASD, there's no problem. But when we go outside, we often refer to the data at that point as being in flight. It is the combination of the two, the concept of data at rest and the concept of data at flight, that forms the basis for Z encryption ready technology, or ZERT. It combines both of those together and attempts to provide it both in terms of pervasive encryption and other tools that we'll discuss now. When we begin to talk about those other tools, the general idea is that we fall under the discipline of IP security or IPsec. And what IP security or IPsec is focused on is the TCP/IP stack and the disciplines that are necessary in order to maintain the security of the hardware, routers, firewalls, cryptology, and the software that is used to define and protect the stack from nefarious players. It's a complicated world full of moving parts that need to be first understood, secondly, pin tested from time to time, and certainly on an ongoing basis monitored for configuration vulnerabilities, both for the configurations themselves, profile, resolver, FTP, telnet, decaf, OMP route, and the services that protect it, servaught, ATTLS, IPsec, intrusion detection, policy-based routing. All of these components are there and available to us under the concept of CERT to protect our traffic and our host from intrusion. So let's break the picture down a little bit more. At the center of our interest is the port. Just as the IODF represented the main policy decision point for the parceling out of the resources of the KEC, the port represents the primary policy decision point for network traffic either leaving or entering our ZOS environment, our ZOS LPAR. That port is defined in the TCP/IP stack. The applications that will attempt to use that port, that is, attempt to listen on it for a request from the outside, or bind to it in an attempt to send out information to the other world, are essentially application programs that must in some way be permitted to either listen or bind to that specific port. And knowing that can become critically important in understanding the level of integrity of the IPsec controls that you have in place to protect your specific environment. Now, there are a number of controls that are provided by RACF in its servaught class. The RACF servaught profile class has 26 different profiles that can be set up to protect ports, to protect net access, to protect the stack itself, to protect vipers, to protect digital certificate access servers, just any number of components within the network environment that can be protected by SAF and ultimately protected by RACF. Remember, RACF contains the policy, SAF does the dirty work by enforcing it. There are other RACF controls that can be put in place as well. Now, when we say bind to the port, generally what we should think of is not just an application, but we should be thinking of a job that is running, that's attempting to bind to a port to send information out to a remote endpoint. You could use the JES jobs class within RACF and other RACF classes in order to protect this port, but you would be doing it, as I like to say, from a distance. You would be doing it upstream. Because there are so many different possibilities for use of the servaught class, I often refer to it as being the ultimate opportunity for putting in place defenses in depth. Yes, of course, you can prevent a job from gaining access to JES. You could do that. But you can also prevent that job from gaining access to a specific port. Why not do them both? Now, when a job does gain access to a port, it's going to take its payload, depicted here, and it's going to accompany that payload with what is referred to as a four-tup. The four-tup is essentially the four elements that are necessary for the endpoints to communicate with each other. Two of the tups represent the job's IP address and the port that it's communicating on. The other two represent the IP address and the port of the endpoint. So now we have what is referred to as a socket. My socket is my IP address and my port. The endpoint socket is its IP address and its port. Below that level, we can encapsulate this into one concept which we can refer to as a packet. So the packet includes the payload and the addressing information that allows us to know where the packet's going so it can get routed through the network, and enough information for the recipient of that packet to communicate back to us with whatever response they care to provide. A bigger level picture now of the complete availability of services using encryption-ready technology, or ZERT, is to add to this the policy management agent, sometimes referred to as Pageant. Pageant provides application transparent TLS, IP security and filtering, intrusion detection, policy-based routing, and quality of service. Oh, did I mention it's free? So there's no reason not to take advantage of it. It provides additional daemons to assist it. The Internet Key Daemon, IKED, the Network Security Services Daemon, NSSD, and the Defense Manager Daemon, DMD. Collectively, what these guys can do for you is they can provide defense filters that protect both inbound and outbound, sometimes called egress, filtering, that can prevent those from entering our environment or prevent those from exiting our environment. They can take our packets and they can authenticate them. They can encapsulate them so that they are secure, perhaps in a virtual private network, a VPN, as they traverse the network to a specific endpoint. And they can also provide dynamic routing to make certain that the service level agreement, again, that we agreed on up front, can be met by providing a mechanism for establishing priorities for certain network traffic. So we're almost at the end here. Our conversation has taken us in a number of different directions from the original 5 silos that we have. Now we've subdivided it, and now we have 7. Those that deal with the IODF, the silo that deals with IPL-PARM and all of its characteristics, PARM-LIBE and all of its characteristics. Critically important, the first address space, ASID1, the access components, APF, SAF, the external security manager, multi-factor authentication, and ZERT, and then the various components of the network and the mechanisms for protecting that network. The final point I'd like to make: while ZOS and the Z15 are the most securable general-purpose business computers available on the planet today, they potentially suffer from one defect, and that is the thing that we all fear: the improbable, the unimaginable, the unexpected, and the unforeseen. And at the end of the day, your job to make sure that this rock is rock solid is to use your imagination and continuously attempt to envision what is improbable. How can you use what you know? How can you imagine that thing that might ultimately break that security? That's your contribution. Okay, so at the end of this, I've included 140 policy decision point terms you can look at and spend some time on. How would you use this? Well, you could print it out and put it into a Word document. They're in alphabetical order. They don't have to stay that way. If you find one that's particularly of interest to you that's not in this list, add it to the list. Okay? 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when you become a mentor to someone that is interested in ZOS, you give them your list. It is the Bible that translates the terms which we talk in. Wouldn't be uncommon for people to have a conversation about PKDS, and some young person right out of college might not have an idea what that's all about. They could look it up and they could understand it, and they could make all of this so much more approachable. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. As Jerry mentioned, we're setting up YouTube channels. You'll find this presentation on YouTube later today. And before I turn it over for questions, I want to emphasize in these times that you stay safe and practice safety first. Okay, Jerry, I'll turn it over to you to see if we have any questions.